The hierarchy of power of the unnecessary Disney remakes is about to change.
We are so excited and happy to announce that a live-action reimagining of Moana is in the works.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
What the are you doing, Disney? So I'm not going to try to sit here and argue that there's some inherent value to be found in the last decade or so of Disney remaking their classic animated films into, let's call them, live action films. But if there ever was one, outside of the obvious monetary gains that are clearly guiding Disney's hand here, I think it would be rooted in the fact that these films are based off of decades-old properties, ones that despite Disney's efforts to keep perpetually relevant in the minds of individuals across the world, could arguably still use a 21st century reimagining. At least then, kids at Disneyland would realize why they want to wait over an hour to take a $50 picture with Bella from Beauty and the Beast. Still, I know I'm not the only one who was starting to wonder what direction Disney would start pivoting in after drying the well of their live-action remakes from their best of the classic animated films. Seriously, what could possibly be left after Alice in Wonderland, The Jungle Book, Cinderella, Mulan, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and the freaking Lion King? Well, it's likely that the sensible among us probably thought that the studio would opt to make sequels to the most successful of that bunch, while trying to find a bit of additional success in the less regarded animated movies that Disney has put out over the last 50 or plus years. You see, that's one of those plans that would, for the most part, solve one of the few problems with Disney's model that has affected the studio over the last several decades. First, it could potentially end Disney's embarrassing streak of failed franchise starters for its own original content. For what it's worth, there is definitely a reason why Disney threw together billions of dollars to buy Pixar, Marvel, and Star Wars in the early part of this century. Their last major successful franchise creation was the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which started all the way back in 2003.
I had been approached to take part in writing
Objection,
Pirates
hearsay.
6.
Last week, Mr. Rottenborn asked you about a quote where you said you wouldn't come back to the Pirates franchise for $300 million and a million alpacas. Do you remember that?
I do.
What?
Yeah, that franchise has seen some better days. Second, any continued cultural success of these characters, locations, and stories is exactly what Disney needs in order to push people into their theme parks, aka where they make most of their money. Finally, and this is just my own personal hope with these live-action sequels, it allows Disney a new bite at the apple to continue these stories outside of those mostly terrible direct-to-VHS stories that the studio started to create in the early and mid-90s to subvert the losses of the revenue loss from classic films being put back into theaters. I mean, once you're able to buy and rent movies, not everyone is going to go back to the movie theater to watch Snow White for the 5th time.
Number 1. Number 2.
So yeah, with all that being said, it certainly seems like that might be the plan for Disney going forward with these remakes. But I think even the most bullish among us would have imagined that Disney would have waited just a few more years before they decided to pillage the content of their most recent catalog to give these live action treatments to. You know, like, let's say more than just 6 years. My guess with all of this is that despite being widely loved, Moana couldn't compete with the merchandising department. So why not use the first attempt at something like this to see if people will flock back to the theaters for essentially the exact same movie they saw just a few years prior. At least then, if this experiment works, Disney will have full license to remake the first 2 Frozen movies just in time for the 3rd animated movie to hit theaters by 2030. Then, if all goes well, the House of Mouse can profit on remakes to recent sequels of still ongoing franchises.
Excuse me? You double dipped the chip. Double dipped? What are you talking about? You dipped the chip, you took a bite, and you dipped again.
and the snake will forever eat its own tail. Personally, I feel like this is going to lead to a lot of people pointing fingers, trying to figure out whose fault it is for all of this, and how did we allow our business-run entertainment conglomerates to get this greedy?
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart.
And while the answers to those particular questions are a bit more multifaceted than simply pointing at one particular moment in time and saying, there, that's the issue, I do think the most obvious event in recent memory was Sony's move to reboot the Spider-Man franchise less than 10 years after the premiere of Sam Raimi's original. A move that was widely ridiculed in its own time, but ultimately resulted in a decent win for the studio. And even though that movie's direct sequel failed to spawn a cinematic universe of its own, its failure still resulted in the continued success of the Spider-Man brand, while allowing Sony to eventually pivot to a more successful relaunch of their own Spider-Man universe. And I mean, heck, after all the negativity pointed at Mark Webb's Spider-Man films over the last decade, people still got a huge kick out of seeing Andrew Garfield return in No Way Home. It was one of those real, legitimate crowd pleasers that you don't get to see in movie theaters that often. Look, I don't know, maybe I'm a little too old for all of this. These days, it seems like everything is moving 100 miles a minute, and something that came out less than just 6 years ago is less of a modern classic and more of an older nostalgia piece for younger viewers. Maybe I am losing it just a little bit. They're doing a How to Train Your Dragon live action movie. That one seems a little bit more interesting and necessary than this. But I'm making this to share my thoughts and opinions, and
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me.
Still, you know what, just one last thing. Even though I think that there is some merit to all the stuff that I've talked about in this video, I can't help but think that this announcement might just be another attempt at The Rock trying to solidify himself with another studio, potentially setting himself up for a power position sometime in the near future.
Things will never be the same because the hierarchy of power is about to change.
Oh yeah, you know what? I might sound just a little bit crazy because this doesn't really track with a lot of the other people's rankings, but I'm just going to say it. Some of my favorite remakes from the Disney classics are Mulan, Cinderella. I enjoyed Maleficent, especially the sequel. Like I said, if they do something just a little bit more simple than a basic remake of the animated film, I'm a lot more on board. Interestingly enough, I feel like one of the things that hurt the Mulan remake more than pretty much anybody thought it was going to was the fact that it wasn't a musical. But everything they did introduce in that movie I think could be more interesting to explore in a sequel. But that's just my take.
The KRW Network.